Hello everyone, today we talk about early Christianity, its path in the empire, its relation with the Jews, and broader doctrinal and political Catholic issues that I think are very important for a proper history of religions to cover. On Schwerpunkt, I've always dedicated a substantial amount of content to Christian history, but when it comes also, and especially to Roman history, which is technically what this video is part of, in a broader sense, I realized I should increase a little bit the frequency of the uploads, because it's as if we were leaving behind some of the most foundational chunks of this early church history and beyond. In any case, you can find, I still haven't done, if I'm not wrong, like an ancient Christianity playlist. I will likely create it at some point, or early church or something, because again, they're not quite the same thing definitionally. But you can rely on my History of Religions and History of Christianity playlist, right? And you also know that on Schwerpunkt, my take on religion is technically what, at least through my History of Religion studies, is the sort of the most traditional meaning of the same, and that, however, even for, say, conventional Christians, so to say, today is often unheard of to a degree, and or at least it is interpreted. This is valid also for many other fields in general, like in very shallow ways that are, again, typically contemporary. So there is nothing to be surprised of, but that's sadly enough become, in fact, so conventional. That's why I use the term to literally distort the entire understanding of this religion at some deeper levels. And you know that we don't talk just about theology, we don't just talk about, in this case, for Christian history, about the church, or just any sort of element that entered that, also the pre-Christian tradition in a truly Catholic sense. We also make political history, not just of the church, but of what was happening surrounding, and so the relation between temporal and spiritual authority. I hope really to expand this field, because I realize that even though normally, especially History of Christianity videos, do not get so many views as the others, there's practically nobody discussing this topic on the internet. Like if you find, I don't know, if you look at military history, for example, you'll have, for some reason, people like uploading like bigger channels, also pushing towards that side. When it comes to history of religions, it's just mostly either a bunch of desecrating channels that want to prove fundamentally that religion is bad or wrong according to the average lesser people under school kind of perspective, and or there are just proper religious history, religious channels, let's put it in this way, that mostly, it's not much about blowing their own horn, because there is nothing bad in going out there and saying, okay, I'm Christian, I'm doing this for this reason, this is valid for any other religion. This is mostly about, just narrowing the thing down to, I'll look at my church, my community, whatever, not looking at anything that is even remotely historical, even probably in the theological explanation of why things had come to be in that way. And it's very dangerous, because you give the impression that religion is just like, I don't know, you're Christian or not, just checking this box or not. This is also a typically American sense of what tag you have on you to be recognized in that mosaic of communities that made up historically, if anything, the United States, not only, still sticking to, in fact, the aforementioned conventional self-recognition and having literally no clue whatsoever about any traditional objective foundation of identities, faiths, religion, and so on. So this is very, very disturbing. Unfortunately, you can just check out, like, most of these topics I discuss are not really discussed in the way I provide, at least in this sort of broader, say, multi-referential sense, right? Not just whichever singular purpose the channel is dedicated to in a in fact, unified way, which is, in fact, the whole point of Catholicism to begin with, instead. Now, for modern historians who are expected or should be expected to analyze these topics with impartiality and without bias, by the way, contemporary scholars, say, are urged to approach the study of early Christianity's evolution with objectivity, right? Setting aside personal or ideological agendas to focus on evidence-based analysis. This, of course, ensures a clear understanding of the complex interplay between religion and society in the Roman Empire, which is multi-layered, right? There is not a univocal Christian direction. There is not a univocal, also non-Christian direction. The same religion of the empire, of course, was Catholic in nature, and as we've seen also in many other videos, Christianity simply flowed into it and never even thought of dismantling the Roman Empire. As such, their stance was something completely different, and as we've seen different videos, also fully supportive of the concept of the empire per se, because that was the Catholic deal, right? If you don't understand the connection between Catholicism, the Holy Ghost, the Imperium, it's over. Just like this is the basis from which you cannot afford literally to have an objective understanding of history, religions, of Christianity, of the classical world, and beyond. Now, there is an important aspect here, a cornerstone, if you want, that is the gradual adaptation of Christianity itself, you can argue from Christ's example itself, to the same Romanity, right? This is important literally in the meaning of the term saeculum, right? You know, the same church is technically secular in nature, meaning that aside from the monks that are basically secluded in some kind of hermitage, that of course is still believed to have an exemplary role, the bishop is literally in the center of the city, right? Which means exclusively Rome, by the way, in a Catholic perspective. Doesn't matter where you are in the empire or beyond. And so a battling role, one that, as you know, will essentially take over many, probably take on many specific public responsibilities, mostly starting from welfare, but at some point also the defense of the cities in the later empire and so on. Today we talk mostly about the early centuries of the empire, so we're not there yet. In fact, we discussed basically the moment at which Christianity was essentially an illicit cult, and or at least by not making it at the top was not much of an issue in that regard, which is also something we tend to simply ignore about, in fact, this Catholic pre-Christian world as much as the Christian world as well, right? There is a hierarchy of threats posed by beliefs that are deemed to be superstitious, that, however, by the same logic are not supposed to have any power to begin with. Of course, the fact that Christianity took over power, even if from a pre-Christian perspective, was it's by itself really, and that's how, in fact, the aforementioned flow into the Catholic Empire eventually proof that of Christian righteousness. But this is also just another thing. We will talk about it in another video. In any case, you see this massive and interestingly documented tapestry, meaning it's very well-known history if you are into the history of Christianity, of early Christianity in this case, the process of Christian adaptation and integration with the social, cultural, and broader system of the Roman world, the Roman universe, really shedding some of, in fact, its more extreme stances in the way they had been, in fact, divinely inspired to, of course, at a human level, become a religion palatable to the different estates, and so having itself known in a less uncompromising way compared to the initial, especially example that, as you know, wasn't much just stemming from an issue with Roman authorities, but also with within the same Judaism. This path, as you know, had been conflictual enough at the beginning, and again, we will also make videos about properly the early steps of Christianity. If anything, I should start a series about this because it's a very also, again, specifically and particularly documented. It's not just about properly the Gospels themselves, it's also about the fact that we know very well what was happening all around for it to intertwine and to be also notoriously historical in nature. It's sort of weird how we have often been fed with this notion, oh, look, the Gospels were written much after. What does it mean? We have the synoptic Gospels at the same generation after. That is, in the history of mankind, you don't have such radical historical, temporal, doctrinal continuity within this such a narrow amount of, historically speaking, these are incredibly close times, and they just, if that alone tells whether you're a historically cultured person. Like, if you don't have any clue when your entire point is this sort of, in fact, heretical, dualistic, Manichaean approach of, if this thing is not explicitated, it means that it could not exist. This is not intelligence. This is some severe neurocognitive dysfunctional syndrome, and we can't properly tolerate this in any public or educational space, as a matter of fact. Nevertheless, by entering the residences of Roman senators, Christianity's penetration into the elite households of, in fact, Rome's senatorial order marked a pivotal moment, right? As Christianity was evidently gaining legitimacy and influence among the empire's most powerful families, so relatively early in time, solidifying its societal foothold. Again, today we will touch on many different topics that alone are worth many videos, but you also know, again, how relatively open the Roman system was to this, meaning that, as we were saying before, this great universal imperial Catholic feudal hierarchy was founded, and we repeated it ad nauseum, including yesterday in the video about the metaphysically genetical divide between the patricians and the plebeians, in fact, also in the same Roman tradition. The necessity of embracing any element at the lowest in order to command it to derive force from the same issue, the same command. As much as it should be remembered that indeed non-Catholic or anti-Catholic cults were legally forbidden, that witchcraft was persecuted well before Christianity was around. Every Catholic empire, so in pre-Christian times, was definitionally about this. And again, we made multiple videos about the so-called paganism. In fact, this lower fractal superstition that has absolutely nothing to do with the establishments of religion in all these Catholic empires. And again, people literally think that pagan means pre-Christian or whatever, and that's literally, like, if in history of religion, it's just like not knowing your ABC, like just by definition, just by not knowing even what the term means, unitly, not being able to immediately connect it to the archetypal meanings involved by a great universal empire. In fact, these various cults were practiced all over within the system itself. Now, in entering the senatorial houses, needless to say, Christianity achieved the culminating act of its conquest, having, as we've seen, entered in a space where the genetically superior elements, the imperium holders, were literally now accepting the specific Catholic declination of Christianity, which in turn, by this, completed its transformation from a marginal sect to a dominant force by securing, of course, the allegiance of Rome's aristocracy, thus ensuring its cultural and political ascendancy. Besides, again, I'm not going to digress into how the different dynamics which Christianity spread respectively to the various estates, because, of course, you find even channels allegedly specializing in the later Roman Empire that in the vain attempt to try to draw parallelisms with the contemporary world without having an actual historical education, are in this great impasse of first saying, no, it was the elites that imposed it on the people, or that it was just lesser people starting to believe in this and imposing it on Denvu. And so it's, we'll get there. I'm not intention now to discuss this today, but just realize it's a complex topic. It's not a difficult. Complex does not mean complicated. It's literally like we know what happened and how and why, also at a moral level. But it's really something that by this time of historiographical development is not really somebody's opinion, really. Rome was, in this sense, the catalyst of this specifically, a city by herself that softened all disputes and transformations. Even, for example, the Judaism of the Tiberian era had adopted a certain worldly demeanor in Rome. And here we're talking about times, Tiberius, Nero, etc., which, the Christians were already there, which the Jews were actually, at that point, blamed in part of this actual clashes within this sects that inhabited in Rome. But it's obvious, aside from the fact that the Jewish community of Rome is very ancient, it dates to at least centuries before Christ. But it was obvious, as we just said, that Rome would become the receptacle of all these kind of ideas, where the same imperium of the holy herbs had to districate all the incompatibilities between the same in order to successfully extend its Catholic dominion over the universe. This is noted in different sources of the era. Rome also had a unique ability to absorb and moderate the same radical movements, blending them into its cosmopolitan fabric, that in turn facilitated Christianity's adaptation to urban elite culture. Again, this does not mean that it was a specifically, let's say, tolerant or even just lax kind of attitude towards these cults. Was an incredibly as a radically rigid sense of hierarchy in these, and we often mistake this for some kind of broader acceptation. There was no such thing like a free check in the ancient world, right? Who was above and who was below really reflected the moral substance of these forces, as well as their formal order. So the fact that Christianity had successfully, by itself, adapted to the Roman theater by reaching the same senatorial houses, indeed manifested all her pneumatic vastity and the capacity of immediately addressing the most radical issues of Rome, of the imperium itself. Rome thus played a significant role in the same Christian secularization, as we just explained before. Like the seculum par excellence was Romanity, even though this had literally bridged the world with God under Augustus and with Christ himself, so that basically both Christians and non-Christians had recognized this in a unified Catholic sense. Rome acted as a cultural crucible where these ideas were essentially reshaped themselves to align with Roman values of order and prestige, differently, as we will see now, from the more provincial understanding of Christianity, and paradoxically, in those, in fact, very regions that where Christianity had spread the most, not just the earliest. In fact, I recently made a video the other day really about Byzantine spirituality that we will refer to, especially in the end. We're talking at that point mid-7th, mid-8th centuries, of much later compared to this. But that actually, in that fractally disordered landscape that we outlined there resulted from the more provincially dysfunctional, often heretical takes on Christianity that developed in those various provincial dimensions, unlike in Rome, right? It's not like the West wouldn't witness the rise of specific heresies or issues from Africa to even Ireland, that, as you know, was namely at least outside of the direct Roman control. There would be issues of that kind. But fundamentally, the notion, again, that the West would be, because that's the narrative, more resistant to Christianity in the sense that also the Christianity that spread at that point should have been less functional or deviated to some extent, was actually the most orthodox, doctrinally speaking, of the two halves of the empire. And this owes much to Rome, but also to that specific Romanity that we know from the West, from the Gallo-Roman, Hispano-Roman, later Latin Germanic also, way to Catholicism that would result actually to a much more solidly functional ensemble than paradoxically the East that adopted Christianity, but which Christianity before, right? Never make the silly mistake of thinking that Christianity is a univocal thing, as if Christ's message in itself did not contemplate the fact that there is an inherent struggle in its own interpretation. Otherwise, the meaning of the same would not have any worth in the world. These are issues that also we should analyze from broader theological and metaphysical sense. This is, again, not the video because we're talking mostly about Christian society within the Roman Empire. But it's obvious that in the moment in which the senators wielded the Holy Ghost by their own virtue, right, and divine bestowal, as we were just talking about yesterday, about the high, the nobility in traditional meaning, would obviously integrate Christianity as part of that power wielding, right? Let's leave aside now from a moment the fact, of course, that the empire would undergo a crisis, and the fact that Christianity itself was actually a consequence of that, meaning consequence of a decline that, in fact, had started in, of course, the moment of peak of the empire, when things started, even though it was not really perceived yet at the time as downhill, but that the most Catholic authors at that time, including Tacitus, for example, would immediately recognize, because notoriously it was part of the great prophecies of the classical world and beyond, in as much as, of course, Augustus, Christ, again, that's the actual peak and eventual decline by collective responsibility. Christianity being, in that sense, the renovated attitude to the same Catholicism that was the universal religion of all the world at this point, in the way that would be ideally, as hopefully salvific, or at least putting a patch on the usual further the gradational step that mankind, or better, humanity at this point, was essentially taken at sadly and as painfully era after era. A very important aspect of this is that non-Christian senators refrained from engaging in all open polemics against Christianity. This is incredibly telling of the status of humanity that I just described. These alleged, again, if you are not Christian yet, and especially you consider this religion as in and of itself a pagan superstition, as the Catholic, the pre-Christian Catholic Romans believed Christianity to be, you would think that if you still got it in a broader sense, you wouldn't need, admittedly, to attack Christianity either. You could simply overwhelm it. But in this case, we know it specifically. They were being cautious not to alienate what we're witnessing immediately is a growing movement that, when countered, could provoke social unrest. We're talking here at the time of Cassius Dio, so again, we are probably in the early centuries of could say the empire, if you consider the empire in that sort of didactical, chronological scanning, but that coincided, as we've seen, with Christianity. If, again, just by convention, we take Augustus as the beginning of the empire already existed, right, in different ways, depending on when you want to make it start. In any case, the main attitude of these non-Christian senators was choosing subtler critiques to maintain their traditional religious stance without direct confrontation. Also because, again, their view, much clearer than our aforementioned conventional one, was, as we just said, much more straightforwardly, okay, if we are right, this superstition will fail, right? And or at least our own will be preserved, our own religion will be preserved, and will not wane, right? As they were still thinking of Christianity itself as part of the equation, as they were noticing it, as we just explained, but without, in fact, being particularly more, feeling particularly more threatened by this than, say, other broader dynamics that were still understood as religious in nature. But I would say also did acknowledge the fact that Christianity was really unique in this own regard, and that too often is said, no, until Julian, things could go another direction, or basically, look, there was Mithraism still, without really understanding how Christianity immediately posed itself, and say caused the specific reactions that it did in Roman society from the very beginning. And again, we would be surprised by how notorious Christianity actually was already after a few generations. In fact, after Christ, if not the same generation of the apostles. As you know, Peter and Paul were dealt with by Roman authorities in quite radical terms, exactly because of the broader implications that Christianity had, right? Also in relation to the Jewish community and beyond. Now, these non-Christian senators opted, as observed in the writings of the aforementioned, by the way, non-Christian historian and senator Cassius Dio, to describe the same Christians as followers, in fact, of quote-unquote Jewish customs, right? So, to them, Christianity was, while quite unique, still framed within, let's say, intended as a derivative of Judaism. In some ways also, in fact, to downplay its distinctiveness and novelty, exactly because they felt threatened by that. They said, okay, it's just like, think about this, because people still do it today. No, Christianity was just basically like a sect of Judaism, or wasn't it, as a matter of fact? Because, again, are we treating history seriously? How do we actually define things? What kind of criteria do we use to put these labels? It's not very intelligent. Like, for an average person to simply pretend to have any kind of historical literacy by saying, oh, well, but Christianity, Jesus was actually a Jew. Well, what is this supposed to be in terms of level of biblical exegesis, or, historical authority, or, what's the level of achievement? And by saying this, like, you think it's actually, it's like smearing, I don't know, Christianity as a non-unique thing, or just because it was derived from Judaism. In part, this is how they were using exactly as a term at the time, thus minimizing what was evidently a perceived threat to what had been up to that point the Roman religious tradition. By the way, it's obvious that such Christian-Jewish commixtion did not exist to a degree. In fact, despite the fierce rivalry between Jews and Christians, there were really very strong clashes at some point. In this period, some Christians were attracted to the mother religion and converted to Judaism, in part also to escape persecution, which I would like to point out was another major difference in attitude towards constituted authority. Of course, the Jews. Of course, I made videos about the Jewish revolt, and so it's not like the best example. I mean, they literally risked genocide at that point. But historically, the Jews, it's not just as we've seen, like they had an old history in the same city of Rome, well before, in fact, the empire expanded to the same Judea. But they had, in part, also just because of their legal, let's say, their adherence to the law, just in a deeper, say, dispositive fashion, like fairly on board, basically with at least accepting any kind of rule abroad, in as much as, in fact, their condition was tolerated by those time standards. A different matter that's, in fact, the discriminant was, of course, in Jerusalem. But Christians took on a much, as you know, different stance that was quite polemical with the empire. Again, not as far as the empire was. In fact, the same Jews in that sense had accepted the fact that somebody else had been holding the imperium, even though in their view the Messiah had to literally manifest as a conqueror, right? A new David that had to restore the Temple of Solomon. So of course, in Judaism, that's basically the horizon, right? Whereas Christianity contested the divinity of somebody else's power in as much as in a performative sense, meaning that if the empire was really not, we often understand it in terms of since it was not Christian, since the emperors simply considered themselves as God. Of course, the contrast is right there, but the Christians themselves believed that Christ had, in this sense, fulfilled a broader prophecy, right, among the many, actually, that he had fulfilled, that we're speaking of, however, for people living in the empire at the time, of the actual merit that the empire really had. Right, or better, they're rulers, because again, the empire did not exist in a statal sense. It existed in terms of the Holy Ghost allowing the chosen people to rule over the world, as the Romans were doing. At that point, the same concept of Romanity had been metaphysically affirmed. There were lots of sort of more radical fringes of Christianity that, and by the way, we can insert within this even some of the founders, some of the apostles, that recognize properly the Judaic nature of this power, in at least in antagonistic stance with Romanity. But that's a topic which, honestly, like, we should really research in much greater depth, because it's not as simple as it sounds. And instead, the point that I'm making in this video is that, of course, Christians, as we also have seen in all the other videos, especially about the later Roman Empire, had fully embraced Romanity to begin with. And this is the point. For example, St. Paul is very much critical of some conceptualization of Romanity, while he was actually a proud Roman citizen. So you can always find that duality that the doctrine of the two natures actually entails. It's not, as some also occult, let's say, pseudo-traditionalists made the point that, in this sense, Judaism wanted to replace itself through the Christian sect to Rome, in a way. There was simply an acknowledgement that, again, the standards of the empire were not enough as far as divine standards, and so the continuation of the degradation of mankind in the process. This is an incredibly important aspect. So Christians, in this sense, were much more conscientiously open to a wider Catholic stance, whereas the Jews were, in many ways, still awaiting their own secular event that would prove that, if you want, in a provincial sense, the restoration of divine power in a way that, in fact, it would have really reemerged from essentially a Jewish milieu, and from there taking over the world, rather than what the Romans had done. So this aspect is frankly quite interesting in many ways, because also the relation between Christianity and Judaism would be influenced by this. It's very interesting to see, for example, in Rome, also up to the modern age, how, for example, the mutual recognition of the papacy and the Jewish community of Rome worked like, right? And we'll surely make something about that as well, because basically the head of the Jewish Roman community would present the Pope with, this every year, with a Bible in, of course, an Old Testament in Hebrew, and he would suggest the Pope to obey the Mosaic law, etc., and the Pope would accept that, and that he would, of course, fulfill this task, but precising that, of course, he would not embrace the Jewish interpretation of the scriptures, because, of course, according to them, the Messiah was yet to come. Instead, Christ was in the Christian case. So the whole thing. But this is just for stressing how important, old, and visceral the relation between Jews and Christians historically always was, and how forcefully complementary Catholic this was. And you can almost see, and this is the main, definitely main view of Christianity and Judaism, for example, since the Middle Ages, but also before that, the Jews must, this is St. Augustine, by the way, survive within Christianity, in a sense to expiate their sins, to pay for them because of the mistake, the error, and in part also depending on how they would like to attach this, the deicide fault or whatever, in as much as rejecting Christ, in a sense, was having him crucified once again. Just think about the Quo Vadis Domine, and in that sense, as you know, Peter was also much more of a Jew than Saint Paul, right? And they hated each other, by the way. Apparently, Peter tried to assassinate Paul as well, but this is another story that we'll talk about on another occasion. This is for saying how non-univocal let's say, especially, again, today's view on this religious history really is, and how, instead, I would say foundationally and as elementarily important in the knowledge itself, really, of the basics, it really is. In any case, Cassius Dio's emphasis on Apollonius of Tyana should be compared with the presence of both Apollonius and Christ in the Lararium of Severus Alexander. This is something we will, if anything, talk about another time. But what is fascinating, definitely, about the relation with Christianity is definitely the very early shared sense of Catholic destiny that they had with the non-Christians in a Roman perspective, right? We talked about the myth, again, that Christians would have been against violence, against the empire. It was full of Christian soldiers. In fact, at the time of the so-called Miracle of the Rain, during Marcus Aurelius' Quadic War, to in fact develop a debate whether, in that sense, the god of the rain was helping. It's often misrepresented as if, that was the Christian god or the Roman god. It doesn't make any sense. They only believed in one god all the time. This is the essence of Catholic religion. Polytheism never existed. If you know what the so-called gods are in the so-called polytheistic, well, you perfectly know that it's an absolutely there is only one divine power, and in fact of universal spectrum. But rather whether he had the story, by the way, that the Roman army had basically been cut off from large pools of water, which even in Bohemia, is serious enough from a logistical sense, and for large concentrations of men, like an army with all their supply needs. And this major rain occurred with the enemies around, etc. And of course, the Romans win eventually at that point. And again, the debate is whether God had been helping the Christians in the Roman army, or say, in that sense, the Roman army took war, or maybe those who were not Christians specifically. All right. So this sparked a debate that, as you know, also witnessed the chance from the non-Christian side to undermine the Christian claims to divine favor by also associating them to, for example, some Eastern customs that the Christians at that point were accused of practicing, such as magic, such as the aforementioned black sorcery. That was one of the illicit cults already persecuted in the empire, and then of course the Christians would persecute later as well, and that was completely normal and existed really everywhere. Those were the actual pagans, by the way, if you're wondering. And the reason why we talk about Apollonius of Tyana is that this guy was one of those pagan thaumaturgic figures that was a bit in opposition to the same non-Christian world, and that also tended, however, to be put in contrast to the same Christians, relatively to this more chthonic vibe that they would give at least to the higher nobiliary and not yet Christian echelons of the senatorial order, those who were in charge, right? Because naturally Christians were largely despised in as much that their religion had spread mostly among the masses, right, of the dispossessed. And of course many of these people had some sort of communistic or even feministic instances to which their own alleged Christianity was bent, but in fact was not really what Christianity really was. So you understand how actually complicated, at least the narrative is. Then again, the picture is really complex if you're familiar with traditional religion. Now, by this time, Roman senatorial families were, as previously indicated, significantly, by the way, nearly half of Christianized Eastern origin, and equally the other half from the Western provinces, reflecting the empire's diverse geographic and cultural makeup, with Eastern families bringing Hellenistic influences and Western families contributing Roman administrative tradition, but both increasingly embracing Christianity just in different ways. In other words, again, the East witnessed this greater level of Christianization, which I would also tie into what we were referring to again regarding the Levantine provinces as more readily surrendering to the new tempers of the era. Like if somebody believed in a consistent sense in the divinity of individual rule just by morris and temper. Of course, this would remain in the West. This is notorious. That's also why the Roman Senate, the Romano-Italic aristocracy at large, remain just out of their sheer prestige and power and culture. Very different, for example, from the later Constantinian Senate. By far the best elements of the empire, even when power was not centered in Italy, so to say, because frankly, not just Rome, but also a great part of sort of Western resource, the West gravitated around Italy, as a matter of fact. So when we talk about, again, also the East, now it's the West is not important anymore. Yeah, okay, but what was the central, what was properly the fabric, the fiber of the West center substantiated, of course, was Romanity. And it can be hardly denied in a broader sense. Interestingly enough, as far as women went, the conversion of the Clarissimae Feminae was a key indicator of Christianity's reach into the elite, as these prominent women, often influential in their households, helped legitimize and spread their faith among Rome's upper echelons, though this was only one facet of the widespread conversion across much of the empire. There's been also the senatorial order as well, which extended to various estates, different regions, and again, with all particularly, at some point, fractal characteristics that instead were truly to be maintained unitary in Rome, as in fact, still today is what is conventionally known as Catholic, derives from. The fact that women would be giving way to Christianity. The earliest is exactly a bit the same point we were making before about the sort of the more Pelagian feminine side of the story that had somehow, by their own choice, surrendered to the notion that, again, upholding those divine standards of rule was more difficult. And this is completely normal, again, for respectively, again, the feminine dimension archetypally that, as we know, is subordinated to the virile one. Just yesterday I made a video about that. And, of course, in this sense, women were a subordinated element. But in that sense, also, the Levantine provinces representing peoples, even though here we're talking Roman senatorial family, so this is not how people think. For some reason, the Romans were looking at Fayum portraits and say, okay, this were the Romans, as if, people in the empire look all like. Here we're talking still about, of course, Romano-Italic families, right? That were the ones in charge mostly of the provinces, etc. Largely not only, for some of them had already mixed with the locals, etc. But in general, the empire at this point was still lorded over by the Romano-Italics at the highest nobiliar level in charge of the situation. But the spread of Christianity among the masses in the East before the West also mirrors that. I mean, people's habituated to millennia of sort of monarchic rule. Think about pharaohs, kings of kings, the Magus, now the Augusti, had this more remissive attitude, and in a sense were also sabotaging to a degree. So Christianity in some of these vessels, as you know, and that's why they turned heretical, so misaligned properly with orthodoxy and its Catholic meaning, would try to in fact create problems to the empire, ultimately many centuries later opening the gates to the same Arabs, as opposed to preserving in that sense the veritably Catholic tradition of a universal empire. However, those clarissimae feminae are not just women. In fact, in a sort of random sense, they are the matronae of the purest blood in the empire, and so the very elite. And as you know, Roman culture was that strong because not just it emphasized the leadership of the virile element. It properly reinverted the trend that the Mediterranean had been taken on by crushing Carthage, but as the symbol of that Pelagian feminine revival. But giving great power to the woman within the matrimonium, which literally means that sphere that pertains of command pertains to the woman, as far as especially the rising of the children are concerned. Then those will enter manhood through the military initiation, as we were talking about yesterday, patricianly wise. So that's another story. But of course, great. Those who had to generate and to rise the next generation of God's chosen people. For the sake of world domination, would not be weak women. And so even in their Christianization, there were a very specifically female, and the best in this sense, female way to Christianity. Above all, the Christian community's reliance on an economy of almsgiving underscored the necessity of charitable contributions to sustain communal welfare and religious activities. And that's why the senators were sort of able to also buy large swathes of Christian population just through this support. As you know, the Roman Empire, also Hellenism, had been essentially energetic in many ways, and again, the privatization of public power at large entailed such protection over the dispossessed, making thus the involvement of the wealthy essential to the same church's survival and growth. That's exactly how it happened. The church was nurtured by the senatorial elite into its development and final sort of parallelism in terms of temporal and spiritual repartition of competences, at least in theory. This required naturally the participation of society's upper echelons, as the only elite could provide the financial resources needed to support Christian institutions and charitable networks were truly the senators, not only telling the truth, but in fact, when you look at even without the senatorial system, again, women were more subordinated to their men, but these were still affluent figures. They could spend to a degree as well from their senatorial purse, right? And the women had that level of autonomy. By the way, this would paradoxically actually increase compared to the ancestral Roman culture in the later empire, in part also through the spread of, again, it's not much of Christianity, but of a different temper compared to the properly cruder and rougher Roman purity. But the same equestrians, the knights, right, and freedmen, again, as you know, think about Longinus, that is a centurion, and that is truly like among the first to be properly enlightened by Christ's blood, right? And so, quite literally, all these figures, and of course, it's easier to document the richer guys, but this would have happened, as we've seen, just literally if you were a Roman citizen, also, modest wealth, but you had slaves, so like the support to these lesser elements was historically part of the Roman sense of redemption, of the manumissio, and the same elevation, this redemptional element to in parallel really with the Christian sense, the gateway to the augmentation, which is the same etymology of Sermon Augustus, as far as the divinity of mankind, the transfiguration, and this passage from a social status to another. The entire concept of Romanization passed through that, of course, according to traumatic rights and duties that had to be rigidly maintained that distribution. So not even the spread of Christianity was merely a matter of charity. It was still within that sort of evangelical practice that the great Roman Empire, also its Hellenistic elements, especially in the East, was already very well habituated to. This is how churches, orphanages, and other communal efforts were funded by the wealthier, the ones higher in social status, thereby embedding Christianity with the empire's wealth system as well. While Irenaeus' Christianity appealed to Celtic peasants, focusing on rural communities in Gaul, Irenaeus of Lyon, Lugdunum, with a message of simplicity and spiritual purity, Callistus' Christianity, for example, entered senatorial households with sophistication. Considered Christians were becoming ever more literate, ever more affluent, just in order to be educated and to take on literally theological, say, probably rhetorical battles. We've seen it in different instances with the non-Christians. Adapting its teachings to resonate with the refined tastes and intellectual expectations of Rome's elite, thus broadening its appeal, right? Especially if you talk the same Catholic language, you're going to be understood. Moreover, and here we're citing very, very famous figures. Think about, again, Irenaeus of Lyon is one of the most famous early Christian authors. Think about the Catacombs of St. Calixtus, Clement of Alexandria. Clement preceded Origen at the Didascalaion of Alexandria. So we're talking about some of the most important educational centers in the empire, right? In this sense, the cradle also much of Hellenistic culture. Reinterpreting Jesus' famous instruction to the rich young man, sell what you have, in a wholly spiritual sense, suggesting that wealth itself was not the issue, but rather the attachment to material desires, which is an incredibly accurate theological point, thus making Christianity also more palatable to the affluent. Again, this is literally the point. If you are not familiar with the doctrine of the two natures, and you think you can read the Bible by saying, I don't know, that it's difficult for the rich to enter heaven just because they're guys, that's not biblical exegesis. This basically like a comic book, right? Let's be honest about things. I make videos about history of religions for specific reasons. And this is not to say, by the way, that, again, there isn't such a thing like an inherent risk to be distracted by wealth, and so it's difficult and challenging, etc. But this is still part of properly the Catholic understanding that the higher you rise, in also the same spiritual power to handle things, wealth can be managed but will not be seen as central, and so you will enter literally another metaphysical dimension that transcends that. Through this lens, Clement of Alexandria composed his work Tis ho Sozomenos Plusios, which in Greek means who is the rich man that is saved, right? It deals exactly with this point. A treatise that argued, in fact, wealthy Christians could retain their riches while achieving salvation through spiritual detachment. This is kind of obvious, also because any wealth is, if not, unless you're lying about it, like creating other, pretending to create other wealth from something that is not wealth, such as attributing worth to something that is not as valuable, is still the product of God. And it's the materialization of our fall in some ways. And so against any Gnosticism that, as you know, is a dualistic heresy that witnesses the things that matter is created by some evil guy that is in opposition to the actual true God is just spirit. So it's a complete, you can't even begin to list the complete insanity of this all just from a theological point of view. But the point of this work was obviously to, and in fact, the Catholic elites were away from dualism. There wasn't such thing. This is often skipped as a concept, but why didn't dualism actually spread among the elites? There are some tendencies, there are some borderline situations like Arianism at some point, but let's say, how much success did it actually have in the empire's elite, and why, according to you, right? In any case, this is exactly the point. This view that is not just Catholically and theologically, of course, correct, was aimed at bridging Christianity with the affluent orders, with the ruling establishment, aligning the faith also with the material realities of the Roman elite that was overwhelmingly rich. Such symbolic interpretations, typical of this profoundly allegorical era, by the way, that underscores the deep understanding of the doctrine of two natures, reflected at that point the Alexandrian school's tendency also to use quite sophisticated metaphorical exegesis, which allowed Christianity to adapt to the philosophical and cultural norms of the time, facilitating its acceptance among the educated, right? And it's not a surprise, again, that Manichaean dualism would spread among certain eras that were sort of more autonomistic among the masses that were more sort of at the margins. Why? Because, of course, a Catholic orthodoxy realizes that the world as such must be ruled, must be lorded over. The same Christian church had to be established with an actual organization of its wealth, right? These were some of the most obvious basic aspects that discussed also in the organization of the early church, as you know. And so these interpretations facilitated Christianity's integration into the empire's broader system. Because, again, if you start denying matter, or at least wine, this is something very weird today, like that even materialists are, like communists, are basically, however, despising people who have more, actually. So they're schizophrenic in many ways, so basically saying, that guy is evil because he has more, but that I want to have more by stealing. It's always the same old story. Of course, any civilization, any human dignity cannot exist with such mentality, and that's why these lesser people always remain in the fringe. This also enabled the church to function within the financial and social networks of Roman society, from the aforementioned almsgiving to patronage in a broader scale. Remember, this is a time in which Christianity is not out there in the open either. So again, there is a lot of submerged that we don't see because the elites in charge were still largely non-Christian, but as we've seen, Christianity was gaining ever more traction. So as the aforementioned cliche went, how did, say, the so-called proletarian would react to Christianity? Well, actually, these people had we must talk first of all the distribution of these people. If you look at the rural peasants, it was very poor, and again, if you look at the shift also between the second and the third century, you know that the direction was to a greater oligarchization of the system. So very often, as I said myself before, we have the notion of Christianity spreading mostly among the masses because, in part, again, as we explained here, from a spiritual point of view, the elites still maintained that they were up to the divine mission. And so we have this impression that, again, like Christianity spread more among the communists of the story. But this is largely because, as we've seen, the church was gaining also traction among, especially, as you know, Christianity spread mostly throughout the cities, right, that were properly the beating heart of the empire. And this is also true if you look at early medieval Europe, mostly we talk about the full Christianization of this world because essentially the peasantry did not really count that much, right? And even though they were Christian, largely many places at that point, they still retained some, as we've seen, pre-Christian, in that case, still non-Catholic, paganistic beliefs that, however, being the exemplification of a lesser status, did not really bother the Christians that much. It's not like during the early Middle Ages, literally, the church went across, I don't know, the rural villages, burning people at the stake because of they believed that, I don't know, that this is black. That's not how it happened. Any kind of that happened in moments in which heretical movements began to be more dangerous and organized, in effect mimicking even the same sort of Catholic hierarchies in a way that in fact was ever more untenable. That's how we fortunately exterminated the Cathars later in the Middle Ages. But that Manichaean dualistic heresy, it's always the same, it's always there. And in fact, in all this, when you look at the rural world, it's not like Christianity ever spread that much in these early centuries at all. We're still talking mostly about cities. Why? To defy also the notion, in fact, that this Christianity was this terrible plague, because there are, again, pseudo-traditionalist authors that equated Christianity to Bolshevism or something like that. Well, overwhelmingly, macroscopically, the peasants that at large remained fringe and, subordinated and ever less powerful on their own, actually were, and paradoxically, nobody tells this, but they were actually the significant obstacle to the Christian universal appeal. Why? Because Christianity was entering civilization, and as such was becoming ever more powerful. The church was ever more organized and in tune with the empire. So again, the entire notion that you've been brainwashed with, that Christianity was somehow positive to the empire, it's the usual pile of trash that you've been indoctrinated with, not just to hate religion from, for example, a conservative standpoint sometimes, like people turning, neo-pagans, even though they don't even know that pagans was something that was hated by the people that they think that were pagan at large. And that is sabotaging the entire system. Also because in that sense, it still brings further this Manichaean heresy of thinking that just if you have wealth, you're a bad person. That, of course, is an anti-civilization and anti-Catholic concept. If you just know how sort of the Holy Ghost proceeds, what's the value of the works, and how, in that sense, managing power really is. Like, conceiving to simply own something in a material sense is a heresy. You can simply command over it, just like Christ took over the world without needing to really own that much. Right, it's a matter of spiritual force. It's not really by controlling everything, also in a material sense. So that is actually what you need, right? Just think about your wealth. It's great if you have it. Why? because you own something. It's because what you can do with that, right? And that's the entire Catholic deal. And in fact, subordinated to life and love, power, beauty, and more, right? So that's really what matters. By the way, who were these sort of, in fact, obstacles to Christianization? Well, for example, the peasants who continued to speak Celtic in Gaul and Galatia. Galatia would notoriously be the sea, also in part because of that countercultural, in fact, anti-Catholic sense that the Celts in their fractal from sort of fringe area had, sort of a inferiority complex toward the empire. This, in fact, it's always, again, a Manichaean matrix. Heresies in this sense are more or less all the same. They all go toward the same direction. The Thracian Bessian in Thrace, these were also some general stereotype of barbarians, of places that, as we've seen also in the video about Maximinus, the Thracian would, even after Caracalla, not really be considered Roman, because they were really inhabited by people who were difficult to integrate in the system because they were just too fringe and too dysfunctional for civilization. It's just like looking at today at, second world countries and presuming that they are at large functional for the sake of the first world. No, they harbor this authoritarian, hatred towards the West because they realize that, of course, they are less and inferior. So this is actually very important. This happens also among, you see, of course, Christians would speak all these languages. For God's sake, it's not like saying that if you were Galatian or Gallic at all, right? Actually, Gaul in particular has a very old Catholic identity that lives well into France later on. Same goes for Thrace. But the point, the accent, let's say, the emphasis I want to put is on the level of sort of fragmentation that different currents took especially in the East, and these are largely all Eastern places, for example, like the Coptic community in Egypt, the Aramaic one in Syria, that just by language, for example, really began to develop some sort of interpretation of Christianity on their own, very often delirating to something heretical. And this is exactly what we're talking about in the recent videos about the Byzantines and what kind of mess, by say just a few hundreds years later, this world was compared to the much more neatly compact Orthodox one of the West, right? Theologically wise. Just also to stress how you can, for example, being Christianized early but still remaining like a hating forte state, anti-civilizational, communist or whatever, and thinking to adapt this sort of psychotic behavior and take on the world that you don't understand to spirituality, which, again, you're not even able to cultivate. So when you look at all these groups and how they are represented, there were many others, of course, and smaller ones even, and that is even worse, right? Representing diverse linguistical and cultural groups whose local identities persisted despite of Roman rule. They complicated the efforts to unify them under a single religious framework. And beware here, it's not like having these identities was not fully in line with Catholicism. It's not like, again, the Roman Empire was simply like, a homogeneous system that simply worked, as if the West we just mentioned was just Roman or Latin speaking, whatever, and would work well just on that basis. But ironically, they were not fully on board with the Catholic notion of it all. The East was notoriously less Romanized in many ways, and in the sense that we explained before, that is to say, these peoples were habituated mostly to be lorded over. We made multiple videos explaining about properly the later rise of these eastern provinces. That is an absolute rise, but not one that, again, would, in relative terms, make them stronger. in the longer run, also in absolute terms compared to the Western provinces, regardless of whether the empire existed or not. This is, I know it may sound confusing. If you've been following my work, you know what I'm talking about, but people make this mistake all the time. They just look at things just in a dichotomic sense, and they don't understand the different levels at which, in fact, different factors were playing, and what was the result of this. By the way, among these mostly rural populations, and so again, the emarginated ones, were the Ditiki of Caracalla, essentially an estate of surrendered peoples excluded from full citizenship under the same emperor's Constitutio Antoniniana of 212, which granted citizenship, as you know, to most free inhabitants of the empire, leaving these groups socially and legally marginalized. What does it mean? It means that, surprise, surprise, we see less Christian spread among the foretestators of the most fringe areas. What a surprise, This tells you how fully Catholically and on board with the Roman Empire Christianity was from an early age, and how civilizationally structured it really had developed, like in just, again, 200 years of its existence. Not even, frankly, at least considering the fullness of Christ's teaching. The letter of Jacobus, that was a so-called Catholic Judeo-Christian epistle that long faced resistance before its inclusion in the New Testament canon. Some back in the day, such as Lagrange, suggested it was already in Hippolytus' canon, but again, I'm not going to descend into these philological issues. In any case, stood out as among apostolic texts as the most socially incendiary. That's why I said quote-unquote Catholic, because this is not Catholic at all, right? Directly addressing social injustices, right? The term was really, again, in the air, with this radical critique of wealth and power that resonated with oppressed, self-styled, oppressed communities. Now, let's not even say that, of course, these communities were not poor and that the world was pretty messed up at the time, like it is today. But again, it's all about how you react to that. So this shows you how in every empire, in every age, etc., there is always that fringe element that has to make a mess because it's whining about being victimized and not liking that there are people who have power, who rule, who control, and that expand because they feel less and they feel threatened by what they are, essentially. And so this work, the letter of Jacobus, denounced the exploitation of peasants by the wealthy, which again was partially a thing. Again, exploitation is a neutral term in part. And of course, there is always, as we explained before, a contrast, a necessary contrast within a Catholic system between the above and the below, because if this contrast had not existed, as we observed in the video about the Concordia Ordinum, the Catholic power, the ghost of the system would not really manifest at that higher level, and the Romans really had the single most, literally most important history of this. This was, however, within the landscape, not of much of an expanding empire anymore, but again, the great, big, Catholic, stagnant empire just preceding the 3rd century crisis. So where naturally all these problems were sort of kind of emerging, because again, there was... It's always there. Again, the social instances were absolutely legit. Some peasants would fight against the order because they lived in terrible conditions, but they loaded this with an anti-civil and also, in fact, dysfunctional, unbalanced attitude towards authority, etc. Again, here, say, peasants here, by the way, they are in the poorer areas, so they're not the typical, Italic farmer that, after all, even though was heading towards that colonist direction, had it still relatively fine, right? On the edges of the empire, of course, things were tougher for everybody involved, but there was a reason if these were the edges of the empire to begin with. And so it's always the same communistic story. The economic abuse of the elite who oppressed the rural laborers through unfair labor practices and legal harassment. And we were quick to hold, by the way, them in court, using their wealth to manipulate judicial system against the poor. So sure, in the time, even the great Roman juridical tradition wasn't about, okay, everybody, there is a a law that can be enforced uniformly across the land like in contemporary states. This is absolutely not the case. More law was there, but mostly only if you were important, if you were rich, you could have it working, etc. And of course, all these abuses, corruption existed, so no doubt. But again, the thing went as much as it turned into rot. Like this text proclaimed divine judgment against the rich per se, so infringing, as we just explained, on a very specifically Catholic doctrinal objectivity. So warning that the rich's action would face divine retribution, saying that, quote, "The wages of the laborers who work your fields withheld by you cry out for vengeance, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Kyrios of hosts," which is interesting because the Lord of battle here we're talking about, so that there is some call to violence and to a retribution that is inherently anti-Catholic, in the sense that this was coming here. It sounds more like barbarians, because these were the people the people to be punished were literally the guys who were in charge, at least. So there was surely also a flirt going on with the forces just across the border, and this is provided that there was no such thing like a real border. But I mean, definitely these were among the populations that I've seen had remained properly less Romanized, also in a truly to the point that some authors would literally speak of barbarians within the Roman frontiers. This well before, again, the settlement in mass of literal foreign peoples, etc., because these were still historically considered as lesser elements of the system, as they were actually uncivilized. And they were uncivilized also, surprise, surprise, with a communistic, classistic, materialistic ideology. Because where you revolve so much yourself around wealth, like with your obsession, you start developing that was kind of, okay, let's kill the rich. This happened, again, cyclically throughout history. There's nothing strange. It's the same old communism. And it connected with those agrarian, paradoxically feministic aspects that in this sense were not actually bought by Christianity at that level, because Christianity was actually becoming ever more, as it had always been, mainly based at the end of the day. And so this tells you also how at different levels of society, different dynamics occurred as far as the spread of the same concept, the same doctrine. Now, the letter of Jacobus addressed the Judeo-Christian peasants of Syria in the Claudian era. So it's a very recent work, telling the truth, speaking to a specific community of early Christians in Syria during the mid-1st century. So it also spread later, so it was reused, as we just explained, in times where this would be also more relevant. By the way, this Christians of Syria that the letter was addressing retained strong ties to Jewish traditions while embracing Christianity. Right? It condemned wealthy Roman landowners of equestrian rank, as you can read in the two part of the letter, Aner Chrysodactylios, targeting the prosperous equestrian, in fact, the knightly order, identifiable by ostentatious wealth, according to the document, symbolized by gold rings, by the way. Remember that gold rings, we talked about this also in the videos about the torque and the same Roman knightly traditions were part of the broader Indo-European sense of sacred, of men of Bunda, essentially, so of war bands, of sacred warriors, the ones of the conquerors, and did like the Roman knights administered these provinces as well in loco, and they had been very much involved with that, also local exploitation. But again, they were part, as we know, and we explained in the video about the eastern provinces as seen, together with the Greeks, by the way, they were in this sense perceived as above, like just under the Romans, but in this sense as these two groups just far above all these other Levantines that were considered historically basically incapable of defending themselves, of being so relatively passive. And it's not like here the thing was just, of course, Christianity was spreading in these areas, but it was appealing to many other people. In this sense, maybe would join this specific and tendentially heretical group of Christians just out of social instances, not just of out of any specific conviction for Christianity. So again, going against those who wielded significant local power. And again, Syria is a place that the Romans have, at least in Claudius' times, not literally just conquered, but almost, right? So it's truly a faraway world in a cultural sense, in an ethnic and linguistical sense. It's felt that the Romans have come to conquer from another country in this fashion. When these elites attended Christian synagogues, by the way, because the initial, say, churches were also at times synagogues. The letter of Jacobus sought to deny them privileged seating. This is what written Proedria, rejecting the practice of granting special honors to the wealthy in religious settings, advocating instead for equality within the Christian community. You see, I was criticizing before those channels that want to say that, oh my God, Christianity was like today, the LGBTQ ideology. Like, if you have literally like a basic history of knowledge of history of religion, history of, like, the mere thing of saying this equates you to a lesser human being. I mean, there is no other way of pointing this. Like, a person who lies, who does not know things, that speaks for stuff that they don't understand, that doesn't even suspect it exists, is ipso facto that. All right? So, basically, these guys, within this narrower reality, were attacking the rich. Why, according to you? Because, let's say, they had rich people and they kicked out of the church? No, they were already devious, and therefore they felt parasitically dysfunctional. And this was a receptacle of, essentially, of communists that hated the more successful and wanted to, like, imagine there were, I mean, some Roman knights that were Christian already. We've seen the centurion also in the in the Bible that recognizes Christ. By the way, that's the gospel, guys, right? It's not like a random guy there, right? And the sense is, I'm not talking Longinus, by the way. I'm talking about the episode of the centurion that brings the slave, his slave, to be healed, right? And Christ helps. That's, you know, that's openly directed from Christ to Romans, all right? So just imagine what it meant here to simply look at the order by which the Romans went and not realizing how it was godly ordained, and that it was just mostly a matter of standards that Christ wanted to revive in a Catholic sense. Here you have, surprise, surprise, the lesser people were envious of others because of their wealth, because they don't even understand themselves other than a materialistic hoarding of wealth that was notoriously not how the system worked at the time, as the Romans especially had a system whereby they had to constantly reinvest, to constantly bring to actual results. And even consider this in a moment of when the surplus was very scarce compared to today, so also the income at large was, say, nobody literally swarming gold in a sense, they hoarded it per se. So it's even less, say, living conditions were harder, so it's more understandable, but in a sense was taking a much more straightforward theoretical path, considering the times dynamics, right? And consider that these are not also communities that have, as you've seen, particularly been on board with the empire altogether, considering the cultural background. From the time of the letter of Jacobus to the era of Hippolytus, so approximately a century and a half had passed, spanning from the mid-1st to the early 3rd century. a period of significant Christian expansion, but persistent social challenges. Because, of course, you can't spread the evangelium, but again, you will always have sin still as, again, the transfiguration is partial. It happens by degrees, but different layers. Some will get it, some won't, right? Remember, again, the video that I made yesterday about patricians and plebeians. And look at what properly Catholic doctrine said about who actually holds the highest standard, right? And why the plebeian felt threatened by this higher achievement historically, right? Christianity did not erase that at all. And what's interesting, by the way, that in this half a century, 150 years that we're looking at, the aforementioned Syrian peasantry remained largely in the same spiritual and social conditions described in the letter to Jacobus. Meaning what? That they hadn't changed anything. They had been able to evolve. Like, by the way, even if, of course, it was difficult for the lesser to socially improve their conditions and whatever. It's not like this is a world that is so rigidly under like a centralized system that prevents the control. Like, if you really want to be more successful in a broader moral sense, you can organize yourself. You can, again, align yourself, for example, with an imperial policy. You can exploit this. No, right here, the Syrian peasantry still grappled with poverty, exploitation, and cultural isolation despite the spread of Christianity. What does this mean? Is that Christianity evidently did not root in or among those who opposed the empire, right? So how many times have you heard the opposite? Question mark. The Syrian peasantry constituted, by this point, almost like a nation on its own, with its own language. It was Aramaic, maintaining a distinct linguistic and cultural identity within the empire, much like other regional groups. By the way, they hadn't evidently followed Christ's example by this. That was not one of whinery about his own condition. Think this literally in a Christian sense. And so this Syrian world was akin to the other nations and tongues that, according to Hippolytus, formed the Roman Empire, diverse conglomerate, unified primarily for military purposes under Roman authority, but still with that successful Catholic, say, evangelical endorsement by the same Holy Ghost. Again, I can't give you the title of that video I made about the rise of Eastern provinces. Again, it's something I made, I think, a couple of months ago that describes exactly this dynamic. The fact that, for example, in the East, cities were always more important, but it's not like people were faring ever better. So when you look at the increase of power of probably these Eastern provinces during the 3rd century, always be aware of what we mean by this, right? We often perceive this from a day to another. At some point, the Romans were ruling from the West, and I don't know, the East took over because reasons, and the West did not exist or was bad. This was largely like a system that went on also with specific dynamics that, as we will see now, would bring on the long run to the almost desertification of this Eastern world, at least compared to the ever more comprehensive compaction of, in later history, of course, as well, of the Latin Germanic West. Again, hadn't these Eastern provinces been the ones across which Christianity had spread the earliest? What does this all mean? I hope that my narrative is coherent enough, because I understand it's complex. And I told you at the beginning, this is not like a simple thing to understand. But if you really follow like point by point, and it's not like I'm making particularly subtle philological points here, like you can interpret this in different ways. But no. There is an inherent logical connection here that you can follow literally by reading the source that I illustrated, for example, right? So what is interesting about Hippolytus, by the way, it was writing in the 3rd century about the story, is that he actually foresaw, which also happens historically, that those groups in the East would dismantle the empire around 580. Again, go watch, and this is completely random. I'm making these videos from the cycle, so they're not literally planned. What the video I made the other day about Byzantine spirituality, the prodrome to iconoclasm, the survival of Christian Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy in the Caliphate. And look at that video and listen to that, and listen to what happened in the East by the 6th century. And who were those Christians compared to those who were in the West, right? Interestingly enough, what Hippolytus called these guys was some sort of national demokratiae, which in Greek literally stands for, here, this is actually a bit more complicated in explanation. I will slightly skip it, but the term does not betray the ultimate point. There is some sort of vulgarly popular element to the national consistency of these peoples. It means that they lacked the upper echelons of society, because this is a demos, literally in the words of Hippolytus. So these guys prefigured the fact that these peoples that, as we've seen, were complaining against the empire in a communistic direction, were really more, they were still in the 6th century, were ruled by the Byzantine elite, etc. But at large, they were, as they had also historically been, vast amounts of peoples ruled mostly by these autocrats without much of a bulk. And so having a democratic, or at least cratic is wrong in this sense, but here it's understood mostly in a sociological sense as opposed to a politological one, meaning that it's a social consistency, it's a social constitution. Being demos, being fourth estate, so the lowest of them all. And what does Hippolytus predict? That this different national fourth estate, this different national pools of fourth estaters would bring to the fragmentation of the empire. Right? It would bring probably to the fragmentation to independent, decentralized entities by the early 6th century. This is not just striking, because Hippolytus in the 3rd century AD predicted that this would actually happen, right, in the 6th century, bringing to all these different heretical chunks of the Levant that betrayed Constantinople and even opened gates in the following century to the Arabs, because of, again, this excuse of heretical direction. But because who is that fragments the universal empire into national entities ruled by the fourth estaters? This is 19th century. Guys, the end of the ancient regime, the rise of the nation state meant as a statalistic, nationalistic, in this sense, tendentially democraticistic system that has nothing to do with it. It is the split, is the collapse, probably the fragmentation of a unified Catholic imperial universal rule. This is so great, right? Because you say, well, why do we have to talk about these topics today? No, Christian history is boring. I don't want to hear it. You have all the answers here, right? This is incredibly important. If you don't get this, it's hard to get much else. Of course, it's also even more interesting to other degrees, at least, that the exclusion, literally the exclusion of the Deditici from Caracalla's Constitutio, their omission from the universal citizenship granted in 212, underscoring their continued marginalization as effectively incompatible with the civil order. After all, why would Caracalla, say, okay, at this point, let's make everybody a Roman, right? No, there are specific conditions, right? It's not just about speaking Latin or whatever that already by himself sort of separated already different types of actual adherence to probably the loyalty to the Roman state. But it's literally like if you're a savage and it turns out that these places are also cultivating a communistic, anti-civilizational hatred and sabotage of the system itself, like, why should we even recognize them as Romans? It's like basically if you have, I don't know, today immigrants that do not want to integrate, like why would you even consider them why would you even consider them giving civic rights? Who does need them, right? And this is, guys, again, we've seen it throughout the whole video, very well intertwined with the whole Christian deal. So again, before you watch yet another video claiming that Christianity was basically communism, that it was incompatible with Romanity, think about that twice, maybe. And indeed, there is plenty of history, illustrating the social tensions that would shape the empire's later religious and political transformations that are not, of course, tenderer than the ones illustrated here. But it's again incredibly important to correctly evaluate, of course, the broader picture, because if you again look at different chunks, like just trying to find random quotes or not having an integral organic synthesis of the whole, it's going to be again pretty difficult to understand anything about this whole thing. And so again, it's all very, in my opinion, very, very eloquent. Like what I would like to stress about this as a conclusive note is that I'm making videos of this kind from quite a while, and I come from a background not just of I had of medieval history, but I also have history of religion in my curriculum in a quite prominent fashion. Aside from the fact that also above this all, I'm a military historian, and I specifically work as that. But I myself did not know this stuff up to a certain point. And you would think that by randomly browsing this information, you would find actually a single element that goes against this narrative. All right? The narrative is just illustrated. I can't find one. What are the odds of this? What does this actually mean? You have random people talking about this and, just preferring cliches and, again, very often apodictic statements and interpretations of this word, etc. That you can also, if you make some history of their words, of course, derive from very contemporary misinterpretations of the past. But you find a univocally different picture here. It's like with Byzantine history. How much else do we have to see the Byzantines basically ended up self-sabotaging themselves for some reason? This happens also in other cultures and other civilizations that say there is a pattern there that you can't fail to see, right? You really can't unsee. So again, Christian history here, I don't know. Again, I haven't made, probably made over 200 videos. I haven't made yet, I think, Ancient Christianity, or maybe yes, maybe I created it recently. So I created many new playlists recently. And again, how can't we miss this? How can't we unsee this all? I don't think it's very, very prudent, so to say, so very cautious to say Christianity. I have I created it recently. Yep, we have an Ancient Christianity. This is where it straightly goes. It's something. I would say it's, again, I would like to have done much more than this. However, we're 30 videos. This starts really being probably like all this ancient Christianity videos are incredibly important. I remember all the time, ancient Christianity is 6 up. We made really, this playlist even makes views, right? So I'm very glad about it. And again, there are some videos I should perhaps re-upload because I used copyrighted images to back in the day. You know what happened in 2021? I had to re-upload everything. I mean, nothing happened. I never received even a flagging, nothing. But I coherently decided to abandon that path. But again, if you listen to the audio is there, you will realize that these went all like there is not a single element that is incoherent in this direction. Just like this video, Justin martyring the Christian blessing to the Roman victory in arms to establish world peace. Fluet sanguis mori torrentis, holy and secular war in Hippolytus. Just as we mentioned him, not randomly indeed, Cyprian and Lactantius. We had, there's also the video about the Roman potential principalities. That's about the Christian rejection of Gnosticism. But because there was a time in which this was truly a risk, and that was in fact fostered by this type of anti-Catholic belief. They didn't want Rome to be the center once again. You see, it's always the same pattern. It always comes from the same direction. And again, it's difficult to unsee it, really. Very well. I'm really glad, however, to have covered this topic because it seems, as you have likely understood, congratulations for arriving to the end. Actually, a very, very crucial one. I'll try to frame this in ways that especially I understand after so many years of YouTube that thumbnails and titles mean a lot, really. Also, video length, the level, of course, like if the video is good, but in general, like as I said at the beginning, Christian history is fairly less watched. It depends. Sometimes I'm surprised by the results, but you may never know also how you choose these topics. And again, people are gonna watch this content anyway, so this is good. This is good related. The length of these videos, we don't really need to arrive to 2 hours at a time. We have this chat, we really talk about it, and it does turn out that it works pretty well. However, again, for today, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.